The Juneau World Affairs Council presents Vladivostok Today with U.S. Consul General Michael Keays. Keays has led the U.S. Consulate in the Russian Far East since 2016. He's been in the Foreign Service for over 25 years, including a post at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in the mid-1990s.
So Juneau World Affairs President Carl Broderson, members of the Juneau World Affairs Council, fellow Americans, ladies and gentlemen, residents of Juneau, thank you very much for allowing me to be here to speak to you today. It's an honor to speak to you this evening for a few minutes about Vladivostok today. Before delving into my subject matter, let me set the stage. As a State Department Foreign Service officer with over 25 years in the service, including 2 tours in Russia, this is my first visit to Juneau. I am here in Alaska meeting with officials and Alaskans interested in Russia in order to remind everyone I meet that America has a consulate in the Russian Far East, a territory representing roughly 1/3 of the Russian landmass and constituting the largest consular district for the United States in the world. The consulate is physically located in the port city of Vladivostok, but is responsible for 9 federal districts ranging from the westernmost Republic of Sakha, Yakutia, to Chukotka in the north and the Primoria region in the south. According to the latest Russian census, there are approximately 6.5 million people living in the Russian Far East. Of them, around 600,000 live in Vladivostok, which is the largest population center in the Russian Far East. America has had an official presence in the region since 1875, and our consulate in Vladivostok has opened and closed numerous times since 1875, with the last opening being on September 22nd, 1992, 25 years ago this year, after Vladivostok ceased being a closed city. I'm the 13th Consul General with that diplomatic title to have served at the head of our consulate, which, with the consulates in St. Petersburg and Yekaterinburg and the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, constitute what we refer to as U.S. Mission Russia. I first served as a second secretary at our embassy in Moscow from 1995 to 1997. I then worked with the Russians through the middle of 1999, trying to resolve conflicts in the former Soviet Union within the framework of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. After that, my diplomatic postings took me to places farther afield. In August 2016, I returned to Russia, this time as Consul General, in Vladivostok, in a position to view Russia from a different place in a different time and physical space. My understanding is that you are interested in hearing about what Vladivostok is like today, and I'll be glad to talk to you about that, though to be honest, it is hard for me to compare personally Vladivostok today with what existed 25 years ago because I never visited the port city back then. But I can see why you're interested, of course, because Vladivostok is also a sister city of Juneau. First, this is what Vladivostok is not. It is no longer a city that is closed to foreigners to keep them out of the headquarters of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. In many ways, it resembles now what it did in the early years after its establishment as a fortress city in 1860. It is a multi-ethnic. It is multi-ethnic. It has a bustling middle class with money to spend. It has pride, and it is home to the Russian Pacific Fleet. When I say it is multi-ethnic, what I mean is that 8 out of 10 residents see themselves as Russians, even though the variety of Eastern European last names show just what a melting pot Vladivostok has become. The remaining residents of Vladivostok are ethnic Azerbaijanis, Armenians, and Russians who had Korean ancestors. There are also many people who are temporarily residing in Vladivostok or who are traveling through. This includes Central Asian and other migrant laborers, Chinese, South Korean, and Japanese tourists, and the occasional foreigner who has managed to start a successful business or who ministers to Vladivostok's Christian community. By all accounts, Vladivostok is more prosperous than it was during the Soviet period. One account says that every household in Vladivostok today owns 2 cars, one for the spring and summer months and the other for the fall and winter months. There is a certain logic to this, and judging by the traffic, I can confirm that the abundance of cars, most of which are right-hand drive, second-hand cars imported from Japan. There is a thriving restaurant sector in Vladivostok, which offers residents and visitors all sorts of food to enjoy, including seafood, East Asian cuisine, Georgian food, and traditional Russian dishes. Vladivostokians can now also enjoy American fast food. There are now 2 Burger Kings and 2 Kentucky Fried Chicken outlets in town. Compared to the mid-1990s Moscow, when I was there, where it proved almost impossible for me and my wife to find some products, you can find almost anything you may need in Vladivostok today. While most Vladivostokians still live in older Khrushchev-era apartment houses, many have renovated and modernized their living spaces. And if Vladivostokians do not want to hang around indoors, they can all enjoy all sorts of things outdoors in shopping malls, markets, and individual stores, which probably didn't exist back in 1992. Judging by what I see throughout the year, Vladivostokians love the outdoors, either as individuals, in pairs or groups, or as families with children. Many young Russians I meet speak English very well. What's more, they speak with an American accent and without ever having studied in an English-speaking country. I'm also very impressed with how many Vladivostokians have traveled abroad. Many of the worldlier ones are sailors who are working in the trading or fishing fleets, but more and more are young tourists who are curious about the rest of East Asia. There is much today in which Vladivostokians can take pride, and they are an unabashedly proud lot of people. Many of the people remember fondly their interactions with Americans in the past. They remember well the Americans who reached out to them to help them weather the storm of social, political, and economic transition that followed the dissolution of the Soviet Union. They remember those first Alaska Airlines visits and all the community relations activities and concert performances that accompanied them. They wish they could enjoy this kind of people-to-people interaction now, but also have an understanding of why it is not always possible given challenges in the current bilateral relationship. The relative political and economic stability, access to imports, and newfound spending power would be enough to make Vladivostokians proud, but there is more. In 2012, President Putin declared the Russian Far East a strategic priority for development, and an Apec Summit was held in Vladivostok. In the run-up to this regional summit, the government made efforts to improve the infrastructure. Vladivostok Airport was renovated, and a new multi-lane highway was built to run between it and the city center. 2 new multi-span bridges resembling the Golden Gate Bridge were built to link the 2 halves of Vladivostok to each other across the Golden Horn Bay and then link the city to the nearby Ruski Island. A new sports arena, the Fetisov Arena, was built to facilitate world-class hockey, and an oceanarium was opened on Ruski Island. The Apec Summit itself took place on the modern campus of the Far Eastern Federal University, also located on Ruski Island. Also around this time, Vladivostokians witnessed the opening of the Primorsky stage of the Mariinsky Theater, offering world-class ballet and opera at Vladivostok prices. And in the last few years, Vladivostokians have seen a branch of the Hermitage open, featuring traveling exhibits from that legendary St. Petersburg museum. The city's circus underwent a multi-million ruble renovation, and Vladivostokians understand that they will soon have a branch of Moscow's legendary Tretyakov Gallery in their midst. In short, over the last few years, the city has seen an explosion of construction designed to make it look even better and more inviting. Vladivostokians no longer have to travel to Moscow or St. Petersburg to enjoy high culture. And they can take in the talent of their own artists in several traditional and modern art galleries located throughout the city. What's more, Vladivostokians have enjoyed an annual international film festival for the past 15 years and an annual jazz festival for the last 14 years. They also host numerous marathons and runs, sailing regattas, and sports competitions throughout the year, which attract international competitors from the broader Asia-Pacific region. Vladivostokians are also proud of the Russian Navy, or as they frequently say, their Navy. They have used annual events like the Eastern Economic Forum, held every year in early September, to highlight the modernization of the Pacific Fleet and associated assets. Last year, they unveiled a new Sovereignty-class destroyer and new medium utility helicopter, the Ka-62, during the Economic Forum. The military-industrial nature of the city has evolved since the Soviet Union, but the role of the Russian Navy does not seem to have diminished. Vladivostokians see the history and life of their city as being connected to the Pacific Ocean and the dramatic events that occurred in and around Vladivostok during the 20th century, including the Russo-Japanese War, the Russian Civil War, the Lend-Lease program, and the Soviet Union's seizure of the Kuril Islands at the end of World War II. Vladivostok is different from the commercial port it once was. It definitely has a new look to it, and its residents and visitors enjoy that new look. A word about Vladivostok's universities. The Far Eastern Federal University, or FEFU, as we call it, was established in 1899 and offers a wide variety of degrees to 41,000 students in 9 different schools. It was recently rated as one of the top 5 universities in Russia. It has over 40 branches in Russia, the U.S., Japan, China, and South Korea, and has 64 academic exchange programs with universities in the U.S., Asia, and Europe. FEFU's main rival, the Vladivostok State University of Economics and Services, which we call VGUS, was established in 1967 and has a diverse student body of over 20,000 students. Both of these universities, the top 2 in Vladivostok, are impressive, and I have met Americans who have studied at both and felt that they received a good education at them and enjoyed their time in these universities. It's a goal of ours at the Consulate in 2018 to increase the number of Russian students interested in going to college or university in the U.S. and continue to support Americans considering studying in the Russian Far East. Based on my own experience at the University of California at San Diego, it can only help when college students learn that there is a larger world outside their campuses and national borders. Vladivostok seems well poised to contribute to the growth of international understanding this way. If I have painted a relatively rosy picture of Vladivostok compared to what some of you may have experienced during your visits to that city in the 1990s, it is because much has changed for the better. But there are, of course, some downsides. While Vladivostok may be far from Moscow, the Kremlin maintains clear control. Vladivostok's mayors and the Primoria region's governors have often come and gone at the behest of the Kremlin, and they know that city improvements depend largely on funding from Moscow. And while young Vladivostokians can get decent educations, learn foreign languages, and enjoy the academic rigors of institutions like the Far Eastern Federal University and VGUS, many of them still leave Vladivostok for more verdant pastures in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and beyond. The kinds of jobs that should be available to university graduates from FEFU and VGUS simply aren't available there right now. And finally, the vibrancy and number of civil society organizations has been notably diminished as a result of Russia's foreign agents law, which is national in scope. Organizations run the risk of being branded foreign agents under the law, especially if they get any financial assistance from an outside source. Often, just the threat of this is enough to shut down such organizations, even if what they are doing is inherently non-political. In July, the Russian government demanded that U.S. Mission Russia dramatically reduce its workforce by over 60%. So, the U.S. Embassy and each consulate lost a considerable number of employees. In the case of Consulate General Vladivostok, we were forced to let go over half of our Russian staff, leading to a loss of over 400 years' worth of collective experience. We were lean before, and we are even leaner now. Being a realist and an optimist, a diplomat and a lover of history, I wish to remind you of our presence and to let you know that we are ready to assist you if you want to come discover or rediscover or explore Vladivostok and the Russian Far East. Even now, when our bilateral relationship is at a low point, it would be timely for the citizen diplomacy of the 1990s to be reactivated. I'm talking about the kind of people-to-people contact that you can read about in the book Melting the Ice Curtain, which describes the thawing of the ice curtain which took place from 1986 onward, starting here in Alaska. Government-to-government policy differences do not prevent state and local governments, sister city associations, and passionate citizens of goodwill to reach out to one another to try to better understand the other side. We talk a lot about different issues in our relationship. Some are security related, some are bilateral, some are regional, some are global, some are economic. But people to people and business to business relationships are the bedrock on which we can build lasting cooperation, discovering where we have common interests and common ground. Come to Vladivostok. It'd be an honor and a real treat for me to be able to show you around. Until then, I plan to use the remainder of my time here in Alaska to encourage a renewed curiosity about the Russian Far East, especially as Alaska and Alaskans played a critical role in building the connections with that region of Russia in the early 1990s. Thank you, and now I'm open for questions.
Thank you, General. It's actually 27 years ago this week that we sent our first large delegation from Juneau to Vladivostok, 130 people chartering an Aeroflot into Vladivostok itself. One of the things that you haven't spoken to, but which I think in many respects has been one of the marring features of the relationship, is the extent of corruption in government and the role of organized crime in Vladivostok. We haven't had any recent updates, but this had been a problem during the course of I think the following decade of contacts between Vladivostok and Juneau. More than one mayor of Vladivostok was unable to travel because that mayor could not either make it through our own visa requirements or because they were themselves on trial for corruption. Could you speak to the situation today?
Sure. So corruption is a problem. In Russia, it's a problem in a lot of countries that I've served in around the world. So, and we make it an issue when we talk to other countries, primarily just because we think from a values point of view, it's better to have responsive government as opposed to government that works for itself at the expense of the people. So, and it makes it hard for us when we're dealing with countries to have a predictable relationship with them and to be able to count on other governments and officials in those governments to enforce agreements and things like that when they are in positions of vulnerability because of corruption, right? So from a values point of view, from a purely practical point of view, corruption's something that we're always worried about, whether it's Russia or France or any other country, right? So yes, corruption still exists in a place like Vladivostok, just as it probably exists all around the world. We have a new city manager or a mayor, whatever you want to call him, a head of administration in Vladivostok. For a while we had an acting mayor, and there was a rotating, a person who served in a rotating position there. Now the city council, just before I flew out here, picked a new head of administration. So the previous mayor is in jail in Moscow, in pre-trial detention. He's been there for over a year now, so that's kind of an interesting development. So, yeah, we're aware of it. The locals are aware of it, and it makes, in a way, it makes involvement in politics in a place like Vladivostok rather potentially challenging, I guess is the way to put it. I'm not sure what I don't know that I would want to be a mayor in a city like that, but that's the issue. Now, on the issue of the organized crime, that may exist. I can't think of like particular organizations or things like that because it's definitely not the organized crime that we experienced in the 1990s when I was in Moscow, where people were actually duking it out on the streets and you had people assassinating each other and things like that. So if there is any kind of sort of organized criminal activity, it's more of like a white collar nature now, or it's more hidden or closed, or it's not so visible on the streets anymore. So I look at that as in a way, as a more positive development. As a foreigner living in the city, I wasn't sure what to experience when I came there, and being there now, I feel very safe. So I'm not worried about that kind of thing like I might have been worried about in 1995 in Moscow. So I think that's a positive development. If you were going to come to do business in Vladivostok, yes, it's a little murky. It's maybe not as transparent or predictable as maybe we Americans would like, but there are certainly American entrepreneurs and business people who are okay with that. And I know that there are Americans who are doing well and living in Vladivostok who've lived there for more than 25 years. So they've figured out how to work the system, and they're doing well. They don't seem to be doing anything that I'm aware of that's wrong or bad or requires them to do something that they shouldn't be doing. Yeah. Other questions?
Diplomacy requires delicacy, of course. You're doing very well. Are there things that you can say that you cannot say? Are there locations where you can and cannot say things? And what sort of issues did you go through simply getting tonight's speech approved? That process is fascinating.
Okay. So the question about the speech, if I want to deliver a speech in the U.S., I have to get my speech or my remarks cleared through the public affairs branch at the State Department. So in the case of me being the Consul General in Vladivostok, it has to go to our embassy in Moscow, and people have to check and make sure it's okay there, and then it goes all the way back to headquarters and people check. So they did a really quick job to make this possible tonight, and so I thank my colleagues for that. And for being able to speak to you that way. In terms of diplomacy, abroad, obviously I have to be careful about what I say because you never know how it's going to make its way back to the country where I'm serving. So hopefully I'll still be able to be allowed back in when I arrive back in Vladivostok. I think I will. That's okay. In terms of places off limits or things that are off limits in the Russian Far East, that's actually an interesting question. There are the Russian Far East is vast. It's very sparsely populated. As I said, Vladivostok was the center for the Soviet Pacific Fleet and then the Russian Pacific Fleet. And during that time period of the Soviet Union, it was a closed city. So foreigners couldn't get in, pretty much. And then even Russians who wanted to go to Vladivostok or who wanted to leave Vladivostok had to get permission in order to do that. And there's essentially two reasons for that. First of all, you don't want foreigners climbing around and taking pictures of all your secret ships and submarines and things. And then you have all these sailors who are going around the world and visiting exotic ports, Bangladesh and all these, Vietnam and things like that, and they're seeing what the real world is like. And when they come back into Vladivostok, you don't want that information to get out to the rest of the Soviet Union, right? So that's why it was a closed city. The Soviet Union has a long history of denying spaces and closing off spaces. Sometimes they call them national parks, and so therefore nobody can go into them for whatever reason, right? And it may be a legitimate reason. Maybe they just don't want people walking around there, but maybe it's because they just don't want people near a military base or something like that. When you have such a vast space, it's kind of hard to keep track of people. So it's a lot easier just to declare whole areas off limits, right? And that can run into problems. If you travel up to Kamchatka, it's very easy as a tourist. You can go and try to do some sort of tourist adventure thing where you take a hike or ride horses somewhere, and then next thing you know, the FSB is driving up in their cars and they're handcuffing you and taking you away, and you didn't realize that you're in a zone that you're not supposed to be in. So they're not always clearly marked. But what I've seen so far, they're usually pretty reasonable about that. You might have to pay a fine or something like that, but then you'll probably get released or something. So there are still in the Russian Far East closed places that you can't go to. I've had some difficulties going to some places that I think I ought to be able to go to by virtue of my job, and for whatever reason, I'm not allowed to go to them. So, thanks.
You You mentioned some budget cuts in the past and how the staff was reduced. And I understand, well, you hear in the news that the State Department, that there's more proposed cuts coming. And I'm wondering if you think because it's a Russian embassy or Consul General office, that you might be more protected, that the current administration might take from others and keep yours, or with your proposal of, you know, continuing efforts to build those bridges. I'm wondering where you see it going.
So I'm not worried from our side that the U.S. Consulate in Vladivostok or any of the elements of our mission Russia will be closed. So that Russia is that important to us that we don't want to do that. It's with any kind of bureaucracy, like once you close something like a base or a diplomatic facility or something like that, it's just going to be 10 times as hard to reopen it. So we wouldn't want to do that. In the case of us having to cut our personnel in Vladivostok and throughout Mission Russia, that wasn't budget driven, so I apologize if I led you to believe that. That was driven by a Russian government demand. So for whatever reasons, we closed their consulate in San Francisco, and they decided that, well, we're going to retaliate in this way. So that's why that happened. So, and that unfortunately is painful. It's a human tragedy. But it actually affects mostly Russians. That's really what's really sad about it. I mean, these poor people who, some of them had been working for a consulate for only 1 year or less. Some of them had been working since we reopened it 25 years earlier. So that was, for those people, it was particularly emotional and painful. And ultimately, it affects them, right? Because Russians are coming to the consulate to get visas to go to the U.S. And after that dramatic forced downsizing, we had to temporarily suspend our visa operations because we simply just didn't have enough personnel to make that happen. I'm glad to say that we've resolved that issue now. We've contracted out to get people to help us so that we can restart the visa interviews and reissue visas. And now we're all across Russia, the elements of our mission are issuing visas again. So that's a good thing because we really want to keep communication going, right? We want Russians to come to the U.S. We want Americans to continue to go to Russia.
I'll jump up again. One of my memories of a later trip was actually going by rail from Khabarovsk to Vladivostok. And particularly as we're nearing Vladivostok, one would see at train stations Asians with gigantic bundles on their back. And apparently these were Korean workers who supposedly were only allowed to be day workers, but in fact are part of an undocumented part of the community. I'm wondering two things, whether that is still at all prevalent today, and related to that, what is the degree of consciousness within Vladivostok or Primoria generally to their neighbors or about their neighbors to the south?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, they're very aware of the events going on in South Korea and North Korea and all the missile launches. We had one of them fly over us and then land in the Sea of Japan. So they're very nervous about that. They don't want anything to happen which could easily spill over and affect them. But they also understand that Moscow is essentially driving that, Russia's position on that. But they freely talk about that, and they express their concern to us about that. As for the laborers, I think you mean North Korean laborers, yes. Right? So apparently they have a long history of this since North Korea was established, of bringing people over. But as far as I understand, it's fairly well regulated now, where they come over, they're sort of contract workers, they're put in kind of like camps, labor camp type arrangements where they're sort of monitored and so they can't run away. And then they go and they do their timber harvesting or whatever they do. They get paid and then they get back on the planes or however and go back to North Korea. Who knows what happens to them when they go back there. So that's an issue. I mean, I've heard widely ranging figures of the amount of Koreans, in Primoria, for instance, ranging from like 14,000 up to 40,000. I don't know that anybody has an accurate figure on that. But for the Russians, I think they would argue that this is a very useful set of laborers. They're cheap, they do good work, and as long as they're regulating it and they're not being abused, they don't see anything particularly wrong with it. I mean, that's the argument they would make, I think. I think we probably have a different view on that, and you got to figure that those people going back to North Korea are probably going to be shaken down, and a lot of their money is going to be diverted elsewhere into things that none of us would like to see happen. So that's one of those issues that I imagine we are discussing and will continue to discuss with Russia as we try to resolve the North Korea issue. Questions?
I'm curious, with the change in the presidential administration here, if you have experienced any change in mission or directives or any type of difference in your what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. One of the big changes, of course, is that we have a new U.S. ambassador. So the previous U.S. ambassador, John Teft, was a career Foreign Service officer. He started out in what was then called the Office of Soviet Affairs. I think his first day was the day that KAL 007 was shot down. So that we're going way back, I think, to 1983, if I'm not mistaken. So I first met John Teft as Deputy Chief of Mission when I worked in Embassy Moscow from 1995 to 97. I was a staff aide to our ambassador, Thomas Pickering, at the time, and John Teft was his Deputy Chief of Mission. So that's how my relationship with him goes back that far. And I can tell you that the man was one of the best experts we in the State Department have on the former Soviet Union and Russia. And in the previous administration, they brought him out of retirement to be our ambassador to Russia. I personally think it was really sad that Russia didn't use that opportunity to work with someone who understood them as well as John Teft did to try to improve the relationship. But that's their sovereign choice. So they made the decision they did. And he had the experience he had in Russia. So we have a new ambassador as a result of a new administration. He's a political appointee, John M. Huntsman Jr., former governor of Utah, two-time ambassador to China and Singapore, who has obviously a lot of political weight and reached back to the White House by virtue of the fact that he's a political appointee. In some ways, political appointees can be very good this way in our foreign service. They can have kind of access and the ability to influence that even very senior and experienced and knowledgeable career foreign service officers can't. So that's the main thing that I've experienced is that we have a new ambassador as a result of the change of administrations. And the other thing I would say is that the new ambassador coming in has already had successes that Ambassador Teft couldn't get. So he's already met with several minister-level people in the Russian government that Ambassador Teft wasn't able to meet with, and he's been able to have meetings with governors up in St. Petersburg and in Yekaterinburg that Ambassador Teft wasn't able to meet with. So I'll let you determine what you think that means. I guess I would say that it suggests that maybe Russia's interested in trying to test the waters and see if there's something new that can come out of a new ambassadorship, but that's a wait and see thing. We'll have to see. He hasn't been out, Ambassador Huntsman hasn't been out to the Russian Far East yet. We obviously want to bring him out to Vladivostok, maybe also up to Sakhalin, where ExxonNeftegas, a subsidiary of ExxonMobil, is extracting oil. It's the largest foreign direct investment in Russia. So, and there are several hundred Americans living up there, so it kind of makes sense to have our new U.S. ambassador come out and visit Americans and see what we're doing out in the Russian Far East. But the schedules haven't worked yet to make that happen. But we're going to try again to see if we can get him to come out. It's not a question of a lack of will on his part. It's a matter of getting people on the Russian side lined up to make that possible. Mm-hmm. Other questions?
Vodka is culturally important in Russia. Can a hypothetical Juneau World Affairs Council volunteer who doesn't drink go to Russia successfully without a note from his doctor explaining this, or is it simply too much of a cultural faux pas to even try?
Actually, the good news on that is that you could do that and get away with it today. And that's one of those really good sort of granular example of how things are changing in Russia and how Russia today is very different from the Russia of the 90s when I was there and even earlier. So Russians today, we have a more prosperous middle class now who have a more refined taste than even the so-called new Russians of the 1990s. And they have access now to things that they used to not have access to. So they have access to American bourbon, they have access to California wines and wines from Italy and all sorts of things that they didn't have back in the 90s, and beer. And they're even making their own beer. So, so all these things mean that there's been sort of a shift just because of they want to try something new and different and they have the means to be able to do it. There's been a shift in drinking towards other things other than vodka. So there's also, and this would save you, there's also the fact that in a lot of places in Russia, there's like almost a zero tolerance policy towards driving under the influence of alcohol. So unlike the 1990s when we'd have a reception and people would come over and the vodka bottles would quickly be drained, now when people come over to a reception, they might have a glass of wine knowing that they have like 2 more hours, and then they'll get in their car and drive home and they'll be safe. So it's an interesting development. Maybe they drink vodka and I just haven't been at those sessions yet. Right? That's probably out at their dachas where they don't have to drive, and I haven't been out to those sessions yet. But I haven't seen the kind of vodka drinking that I used to see in the 90s. And also I haven't seen a lot of the smoking that I used to see. There used to be heavy smokers, and I don't see that so much anymore. That's interesting.
Anyone else? Thank you very much
All
for
right.
being here.
Thank you.
That was Michael Keays in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation produced in collaboration with 360 North. It was recorded December 29, 2017 at 360 in Juneau, with support from Alaska Airlines, Alaska Electric Light and Power Company, Alaska Power and Telephone, Coeur Alaska Incorporated, GCI, Hecla Greens Creek Mining Company, Haight and Associates, the Prospector Hotel, Sea Alaska, and Wassman and Associates Incorporated.